People keep asking if Iran and Israel could go to war again. Here's the uncomfortable answer. In one sense, that war never actually stopped. It just changed shape more than once since February. What's changed in the last 2 weeks specifically is who's doing the fighting and how close the current round is getting to becoming a two-front confrontation again. Let's rebuild the timeline quickly because it matters for understanding where things stand today. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran, targeting its nuclear facilities and ballistic missile program, with U.S. officials describing the goal as pushing back Iran's weapons capability and, according to some reporting, hoping to trigger a change in leadership. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed on the first day of that campaign, according to multiple international outlets, and his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was later named as his successor. Iran responded with waves of missile and drone strikes against Israel, against American bases across the region, and against Gulf states hosting U.S. forces, including strikes that reportedly hit a U.S. Navy service center in Bahrain. Early in the conflict, President Trump publicly rejected any negotiated settlement, posting that there would be no deal with Iran except what he called unconditional surrender. After more than 5 weeks of fighting, the United States, Iran, and Israel agreed to a ceasefire on April 7th and 8th. Mediated by Pakistan, which was extended indefinitely by late April after the initial 2-week window held. That ceasefire held mostly for about 2 months, but it was never fully quiet. On June 7th, Israeli forces struck southern Beirut and Iran responded by launching ballistic missiles at Israel, which Israel then retaliated against. According to Britannica's ongoing conflict tracker, that brief exchange marked the first direct Iran-Israel confrontation since the April ceasefire. A second flashpoint nearly happened on June 14th, when renewed Israeli strikes in Beirut reportedly pushed Iran toward retaliating again, but American intervention held that off long enough for negotiators to finish a separate, more detailed agreement with Washington. That agreement, a 14-point memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran, was finalized around June 14th to 17th. It set a 60-day ceasefire window, reopened the Strait of Hormuz to shipping, and lifted the U.S. naval blockade Iran had been operating under since earlier. Failed talks in Islamabad had broken down. According to shipping industry tracking, commercial traffic through the strait hit a 2-month high in the days after the reopening, and 3 Iranian supertankers carrying a combined 3.8 million barrels of crude made it out of the blockade perimeter for the first time in 2 months. But according to ABC News's reporting on how that agreement broke down, the language on the strait was the weak point from the start. It only required Iran to allow safe passage for 60 days and didn't rule out Iran charging fees on ships afterward. Iran read that as a green light to eventually reassert control over the strait. Just over a week after signing, Iran launched a drone strike on a ship inside the strait. The U.S. treated it as a ceasefire violation and responded with limited strikes. Then, on July 6th and 7th, Iran attacked 3 commercial vessels in the strait directly. President Trump said on July 7th that he now considered the truce over, and the U.S. ramped up its response. In the days since, U.S. forces have struck Iranian infrastructure, including bridges and targets near the Bushehr nuclear plant, while Iran has hit back at U.S. allied infrastructure in the Gulf, including a desalination plant in Kuwait earlier this week. As of this week, according to the Associated Press, hopes for renewed diplomacy are reportedly still alive. Even as the fighting over Hormuz has intensified, and U.S. House Republicans have taken the first legislative step toward a $95 billion Iran war funding package. So here's the answer to the actual question. Right now, the active fighting is overwhelmingly a U.S.-Iran story, centered on the Strait of Hormuz, not a direct Israel-Iran exchange. Israel was a co-combatant in the original February campaign and struck Iranian-linked targets again in early June, but the last 2 weeks of escalation have been driven almost entirely by Washington and Tehran. That distinction matters, because it changes what war again would actually mean if it happened. A renewed direct Israel-Iran exchange, on the scale of the February campaign, would be a different and separate development from what's currently unfolding. Now, why does any of this matter if you're not in the region? A few reasons, and they're not abstract. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply, according to U.S. Energy Information Administration figures, cited in recent regional risk assessments. Every time Iran threatens or strikes shipping there, insurance costs for tankers spike. And that gets priced into fuel costs well beyond the Middle East, sometimes before governments even issue official statements about what's happening. The conflict has already caused documented fuel shortages in parts of Asia and disrupted global shipping routes, with several major carriers, including some of the world's largest container shipping companies, still routing vessels around the southern tip of Africa, entirely rather than risk the strait, adding significant time and cost to global trade. Economic analysts tracking the conflict describe the risk to global growth and asset prices as a fast-moving situation that can escalate faster than markets can adjust. There's also a direct link to U.S. domestic politics, since Congress is now actively debating a large new war funding package, which means American taxpayers have a growing financial stake in how this resolves. And for anyone tracking broader Middle East stability, this conflict has already pulled in Lebanon, reigniting fighting between Israel and Hezbollah there after strikes on southern Beirut in June, and displaced more than 1/6 of Lebanon's population, according to Britannica's tracking of the war's regional impact. This story looks different depending on who's telling it, and both sides have publicly stated positions worth hearing directly. The American and Israeli position, along with most Gulf states, is that Iran violated the terms of the ceasefire first, by attacking commercial shipping despite agreeing to guarantee safe passage, and that the current strikes are a targeted response to that violation rather than a new war. The Gulf Cooperation Council has publicly called for unrestricted access through Hormuz and argued that lasting regional peace requires addressing what it calls the full spectrum of Iran's threats, including its missile program and support for armed groups abroad. Iran's position is different, and it's rooted in three conditions its president laid out back in March: firm guarantees against future attacks, recognition of what Iran calls its legitimate rights, and compensation for war damages, including its missile program and support for armed groups abroad. Iran's position is different, and it's rooted in three conditions its president laid out back in March. One that would let it collect fees rather than guarantee free passage indefinitely. When a formal counterproposal along those lines was submitted through Pakistani mediators, it reportedly asked for U.S. recognition of Iranian authority over the strait and compensation for war damage, without mentioning the nuclear program at all, and it was rejected by Washington. Adding to the complexity, Iran's supreme leader has reportedly expressed a different view from Iran's own elected president on how far the June agreement should go, while saying he'd accepted assurances that Iran-aligned armed groups would be protected in any further talks. Iran has also said that any wider ceasefire in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah remains a precondition for broader talks, tying the Hormuz standoff directly to that separate front. So, back to the original question, could this expand into a direct full-scale Iran-Israel war again? Analysts are genuinely split, and none of them are making confident predictions. Some risk assessments describe the situation as a high-variance environment, where a handful of specific triggers, a resumed missile test, a strike on the wrong target, a misread signal, could shift things from contained skirmishing back toward the kind of direct exchange seen in February. One geopolitical risk analysis published this year framed the decision facing Israeli planners less as a single dramatic choice and more as an ongoing calculation, watching whether Iran's conventional missile capacity is being rebuilt faster than diplomacy can slow down its nuclear program. If that gap narrows enough, the same analysis suggests, Israeli leaders could see a narrowing window where another strike still looks feasible at an acceptable cost, not necessarily aimed at ending the program outright, but at pushing Iran's capabilities back again. Other analysts point out that Israel's appetite for another major confrontation with Iran may be limited right now, given the ongoing costs of managing Gaza, Lebanon, and maritime threats simultaneously, unless Israeli leaders conclude Iran has crossed a clear red line, like meaningfully rebuilding its nuclear or missile capacity. A third view treats the current Hormuz fighting as likely to stay contained to the U.S. and Iran specifically, at least in the near term, precisely because both Washington and Tehran have signaled they still want a negotiated framework rather than open-ended war. Separate regional risk reports published earlier this year flagged a possible Phase 2 of the wider Israel-Iran conflict as a real but lower probability tail risk for the rest of 2026, rather than something analysts consider likely or imminent. What's clear is that calling this situation resolved would be inaccurate, and calling it a guaranteed return to full war would be equally inaccurate. It's an active, unresolved conflict with a ceasefire that's already broken down once, sitting in a genuinely unstable middle ground, and the next few weeks of diplomacy around Hormuz will likely tell us more than any single headline can right now. It's worth watching closely rather than assuming either extreme. This analysis drew on reporting and data from the Associated Press, ABC News, Britannica's ongoing conflict coverage, the UK House of Commons Library, and independent regional risk assessments. If you want to actually understand what's happening in the Gulf right now instead of just the headlines, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Subscribe if you want more of this, and I'll see you in the next one.